There's been several disturbing news items lately concerning historical monuments, historical figures, statues, things like that. The latest one was concerning Thomas Jefferson. His statue was in a prominent place in a political hall. I think it was a capital of some state. In any event, there was a protest that he was there because he owned slaves. Well, there's a sign over the library at the institution I attended undergraduate and graduate school at that said anyone who knows only his own generation remains forever a child. And that's what we've got here. We got a bunch of children protesting. This guy's bad because he owned slaves. He wasn't bad because he owned slaves. He would be bad now if he owned slaves, but not back then. But these people know no history. The reason he was there is because he was a great mind in forming and formulating our political system. He was a great mind, worked on drafting the Constitution to the United States of America. Slavery regarding that document is probably somewhat irrelevant, although there were some compromises made, more likely than not based on slavery. But again, that was the times. So if we're going to judge everybody by the times, at the present time, then you can probably consider most of us assholes. I remember growing up in a small town. It was a northern state. There wasn't much racial conflict. We had diversity, sort of, in our small town, but there were no blacks because the West wasn't settled so much by blacks by then. Although Denver had a lot of blacks because its primary source of labor was the federal government, and the federal government didn't discriminate in their hiring practices back then. So we had a higher percentage of blacks in Denver than a lot of other cities. And I can remember when I was in junior high, my mother was the head of the Veterans of Foreign Wars Women's Auxiliary. And they were having a state convention in Loveland, which was my hometown. And there was a big debate because Loveland had a sundown rule, which meant that black people were not allowed to stay overnight in the town. They had to be out of the city limits by sundown. So the club debated how to handle that for 3 or 4 meetings, whether to do this or to do that, to tell the black people get hotels, accommodations elsewhere, or go to Denver and commute to Loveland. All these possibilities were debated. They ended up having the convention, and they went to all the motel and hotel operators and said, this is what's going to happen if we want to keep the convention. You're going to have to rent. They had no opposition. But did that mean all the people in Loveland at that time were bad because the town voted on a sundown rule that dated back to the incorporation of the city? I don't think so. I think there were a lot of good people in Loveland. I didn't stay there because I thought probably I'd be lynched because of my political beliefs. But it wasn't because of my race that I'd get lynched. It was because it's not particularly a liberal town. But even then, not a particularly liberal town. They did have the convention, and they did have black delegates, and they enjoyed staying in Loveland. It was a very pretty city. And things like this can be resolved, but you just can't say this is bad because of that and put it in context of today. You've got to look at the context in history. There was a time when most landowners in the South had slaves. I can remember, and my grandfather wasn't proud of it, and he finally rebelled, but one of my ancestors was an admiral for the East India Company. They had their own fleet. They were merged sort of in with the British Navy, but the British Navy existed pretty much on privateers. And how did they get their crews? Well, they did what they called Shanghai. So they had press gangs on the docks of London, hanging out near the bars, and somebody comes out of a bar fairly drunk. They'll corral him, throw him on board the ship, and by daybreak they have an able-bodied seaman ready to go. A lot of the seamen on these ships were shanghaied or kidnapped, and that's how they filled their crew. A folk song I remember singing when I was doing that. What do you do with a drunken sailor? Well, you do a lot of things, but mainly you press him into the press gang and you make him go aloft and set sails, things like this. Now, do we judge everybody on that basis? Were my ancestors all bad because they shanghaied sailors for their ships? Even though the British ruled the seas at that time, I don't think they could have ruled the seas with an all-volunteer Navy or merchant marine. Those are things to think about, and things that I think about all the time. And I think coming up, we're going to have to talk about that in conjunction with corporate America and corporate imperialism and corporate capitalism. And thank you for watching. You guys have a good day, have a good weekend, and happy Halloween. Bye.